This is Module 2 of the pre-recorded induction package for the Joint Intersectoral Analysis Framework. My name is Marcus Elton. I work for OCHA's Assessment, Planning and Monitoring branch.
The JIAF is a multi-partner endeavor that brings together UN agencies, NGOs, and donors.
This is the second of 4 modules. Module 1 provided a broad overview of the JIAF approach. Module 3, the next one, will take a closer look at the JIAF methodology. And the last and fourth module will discuss the key steps of the JIAF process. Each module is about 20 minutes short. Together they constitute a non-technical induction package. More advanced technical training material is available on the JIAF website and OCHA's knowledge management platform.
This session is part of a broader training plan for JIAF 1.1. The plan is composed of 3 elements: 4 high-level pre-recorded presentations, 8 more in-depth blended sessions, and workshops and webinars.
This module will take a closer look at the JIAF concept, where it will discuss multi versus intersectoral analysis. It'll describe in more detail the key elements of the JIAF approach. We're going to look more closely at the conceptual framework, the indicators, and introduce the PiN aggregation. So, how is intersectoral analysis different from multi-sectoral analysis? With multi-sectoral is meant the listing or grouping of sectoral issues without looking at their interconnections or overlaps, or trying to understand how they all come together in the same unit of analysis, such as, for example, a vulnerable group. Intersectoral or cross-sectoral approaches, on the other hand, highlight the importance of system thinking and consider issues as a whole, across sectors, and the range of factors that collectively influence, in this case, humanitarian conditions, or how situations in one sector influences or impacts upon one or more other sectors. The purpose of intersectoral analysis is to help build synergies across sectors so as to tackle the complex issues for achieving interrelated humanitarian development goals and targets. The analytical outputs of the JIAF should help understand the interrelationship between sectoral problems, their overlaps, commonalities, and the differences manifested in the most vulnerable groups, as opposed to a disjointed narrative without common unit of analysis, where sectoral issues are being unpacked in isolation or loosely grouped under thematic headers. If you think about it, people don't run their family in cluster thematics either. They articulate their needs as a whole. The problematic becomes clear if one looks at older HNOs, humanitarian needs overviews, which feature often a lengthy narrative with one sectoral problem listed after the other. This has improved in more recent HNOs with the help of the JIAF. So I can encourage you to look and compare some recent HNOs, in particular the sections 1.4, where humanitarian conditions are being analyzed. As introduced in Module 1 of this series, there are 2 key elements to the JIAF approach: the conceptual framework and the severity model, which has the 2 components of a standardized severity scale and a list of agreed indicators. These 2 key elements, the conceptual framework and the severity model, are the foundation, the ingredients needed to perform a PiN aggregation. But we'll look at that in a bit. Let's first spend a little bit more time in understanding better the conceptual framework. As explained in Module 1, the conceptual framework is built around 5 pillars, starting with context, followed by event, shock, impact, humanitarian conditions, and current and forecasted priority needs. Each of these pillars contain different sub-pillars. This serves to organize information, visualize relationships, and bring a consistent structure to your analysis. The JIAF conceptual framework, in a way, or put simply, helps to frame the story of a population affected by a shock in a consistent and comprehensive manner. The first 3 pillars, context, event, shock, and impact, allow response actors to define the scope of the crisis, to identify all affected geographic areas, and estimate the total number of people who have been affected by it, disaggregated by key demographic characteristics. The first pillar, the context pillar, describes the relevant characteristics of the area of interest. It has 9 sub-pillars: political, socio-cultural, economic, legal and policy, technological, demographic, security, infrastructure, and environmental conditions. An example would be remittances that contribute to the GDP of a certain country. Roads outside the capital that are unpaved. The legal framework the country has to legislate humanitarian response, etc. The second pillar, the shock and the impact, looks at events or conditions that disrupt the functioning of a community or society and cause human, material, and economic or environmental losses. It distinguishes between drivers and underlying factors. An example could be, a simple example obviously of a shock would be an earthquake. Its magnitude, the exposure of people to it, the extent of it, or erupting conflict, its intensity, etc. The third pillar looks at the event and shock on population, systems and services of the affected area. It distinguishes 3 sub-pillars: impact on people, losses and damages to assets and capital, displacement, violence, mobility issues and livelihoods, etc. The second one is the impact on systems, the damages to infrastructure or means of communication, disruption of social cohesion, markets, services, etc. And the third element looks at the impact on humanitarian access, obstacles or challenges for people in need to access relief actors or for relief actors to access people in need, and other physical constraints. The fourth pillar, the humanitarian conditions pillar, is where the consequences of the shock or the event, its impact on people, are identified in terms of magnitude and analyzed in terms of severity. The severity of humanitarian conditions is estimated by taking into account 3 humanitarian consequences. You can see them here on the slide: living standards, coping mechanisms, and physical and mental well-being. We'll look at that in more detail in a bit. Finally, the 5th pillar applies a forward-looking lens. The idea here is to project the needs based on the most likely evolution of the crisis during the planning period. This forecasting will also include projecting how needs may change in the absence of assistance that is currently being provided. These are the 5 pillars that define the conceptual framework. Now let's have a look at sort of the heart of the framework, the humanitarian conditions pillar. Zooming in into the humanitarian conditions pillar, we see that all the 3 sub-pillars are interrelated. The progression of humanitarian consequence does not always follow a linear sequence, from the inability to access basic goods or services to the adoption of negative coping mechanisms, and finally the impact of the previous on physical and mental well-being. In fact, feedback loops exist between the 3 sub-pillars, and each can contribute to a negative outcome in the other. Think of disabilities or malnutrition can in turn lead to challenges in accessing basic services, goods and services, etc. Since it's difficult to understand what exactly precedes and contributes to what, attempts to understand causality effects between the humanitarian conditions sub-pillars is not the focus. It's not recommended even. The severity in one sub-pillar taken individually or in isolation of other sub-pillars is also not very useful, as it provides only a partial picture of people's humanitarian conditions. For instance, a population group can present seemingly good levels of access to basic goods or services, the living and standard sub-pillar, but only because they started to engage in negative and irreversible coping strategies. Only the 3 sub-pillars taken together and aggregated into a final humanitarian condition narrative and score can reflect an overall humanitarian conditions and their severity. So, how does then the analysis of severity of needs happen? What happens in that arrow going from the condition sub-pillars to the severity of needs? We'll be looking at this now in more detail. As we saw in Module 1, measuring intersectoral severity, the degree of harm brought by all combined humanitarian conditions, is a central function of the JIAF and is achieved by applying the JIAF severity model, supported by a set JIAF severity scale. Here, what we see is a sunburst of all the indicators used in assessing humanitarian conditions. In total, there are 116 standardized indicators in the JIAF reference table. Of those, 99 indicators relate directly to the humanitarian conditions pillars. And you can see in this screenshot that all the sectors are represented with varying numbers of indicators, but they are all there and they're all linked to a pillar in the framework. Here we are looking at the actual JIAF reference table, and on this slide, you'll have to zoom in a little bit. You see how each indicator is actually described. It starts on the left with the sector and the subsector, then it's tagged by the pillar and subpillar, the actual indicator name label, the data collection method, and then you see all the thresholds defined from 1 to 5, defined by indicator. I recommend you take a look at the actual table. The link is in the JIAF guidance to browse through it and get familiar a little bit with the reference table. So, with help of those 99 indicators of the humanitarian conditions sub-pillar and the severity scale defined for each of those indicators, we can now estimate the number of people in need. Doesn't always have to be those 99 indicators. In fact, in reality, it's often much less, and less might even be more when it comes to calculating PiN. The JIAF approach distinguishes between two PiN aggregation scenarios. The main difference between these two scenarios are, should you have one data set at a household level from one assessment, let's say a multi-sectoral needs assessment, an MSNA, that links all the indicators, then you find yourself in a data aggregation scenario A. Should you find yourself, however, as is often the case in many operations, in a context where there's multiple data sets, multiple assessments, and you have to bring this all together and make sense of all this, then you find yourselves with pretty much certainty in a data aggregation scenario B. We won't be going into much further detail in this module. However, module 3, the next module, will explain in more detail how PiN aggregation is done. In addition, there is going to be a more technical module for those that really have to do the number crunching, that will go step by step, looking at the method, the tools, and the process. With this, we're coming to the end of this module 2. During this module, we looked at the difference between intersectoral versus multisectoral analysis. We looked at, in more detail, the key elements of the JIAF approach. In particular, we looked at the 5 pillars of the framework and zoomed into this pillar 4 and looked at how the 3 sub-pillars around living standards, coping mechanisms, and well-being interrelate. We looked furthermore in more detail at the severity model, in particular how indicators are described and standardized. We didn't go much into PiN aggregation. Important to remember from this session that there are 2 scenarios, A and B, of which A, put in simple terms, would be based on a single data set or data sets that are clearly linked, versus a scenario B, which is the case in many of the operations where we have to make sense of many different data sets and different assessments that are not linked as such. For more information precisely on this, you are encouraged to listen into Module 3 and 4, also available on the JIAF website and Otra's knowledge management platform. With this, thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope this was useful for you.